Isn't it funny how when we're young, we never think about how good our situations are until they change? Are you all packed? I turned around to face my mother. Her smile was bright and cheery, the opposite of how I felt. Yes. Good, she praised. Your father is waiting downstairs. Shall we get going? Our reservations won't last forever. I nodded. Do I have a choice? As if she heard my thoughts, her face fell a bit before walking out of my room. Her reaction only made me angry. She didn't deserve to pity me. She signed me up for this. This was her fault. The car ride was silent. None of us wanted to talk about it, especially me. My fate was unavoidable, so why rub it in? I heard Kai speaks French. My mother spoke, breaking the thick quietness of the atmosphere around us. Just hearing his name made me shudder. Kai Parker, does he? I asked dully. Yes, you should ask him to speak to you in French. Sometimes she grinned, quirking a brow in my direction. If I hadn't been held back by my seatbelt, I probably would have swung at her. I'm not normally violent, but the way she decides to strike up conversations really turned me around for the worse. Hisham, flirting with my forced husband. Definitely sounds like a turn-on, I muttered to myself. Well, it's better than giving him the cold shoulder, she countered, ignoring my sarcasm. Coffee break, I looked out of the window. You try being in an arranged marriage, and then let me know what you would do, Mom, I said flatly. She didn't respond. I apparently wasn't worth the fight. Arranged marriage. My thoughts drifted to my husband-to-be. I had only met him once, and it was one of the worst experiences I ever had with a man. He was arrogant, cold, and looked at me as if I was a dirty animal. How was I going to marry someone like that? Someone so detached? Dread rose in my throat the more I thought about everything. There was no way out. I was stuck. The car slowed to a stop, signaling our arrival. Expectantly, I was the last one out of the car. I took my time getting my seatbelt off and stepping out of the CA door. Based on my mother's irritated glances, she wasn't a fan of my slowness. Good. Sometime today would be nice, Rowan, my mother reprimanded, grabbing my arm. What's the rush? I asked, wincing from her tight grasp. We're already fashionably late enough. Let's not push the envelope. I sighed as she practically dragged me into the restaurant. Inside was nothing short of beautiful. The red carpets and mahogany tables screamed elegance. It was an ignominy that a place like this wouldn't be a fond memory of mine. My mother suddenly screeched and ran up to Mrs. Parker, who had been seated comfortably at a large table in the back of the restaurant. My father hung back with me while the two women conversed. I wished their banter would go on forever, but I wasn't lucky enough for that. My mother quickly turned to me and grabbed my arm again. Lillian, isn't my Rowan darling? She asked, smiling. Mrs. Parker smiled and nodded. She's stunning, Alice. Absolutely stunning. My cheeks heated at the compliment, and I quietly thanked her. You know, my Kai is somewhere, Mrs. Parker began, but trailed off as she found him. I reluctantly looked in her direction, seeing him leaning against the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. It's because of me. Mrs. Parker waved at Kai wildly. Come over here, Kai. Dinner is starting. She seemed embarrassed of his drinking. I figured he must either do it too often, or never, based off of her disappointed reaction. Kai placed his glass down and slowly walked towards us. My breath caught in my throat. Seeing him so close to me made me forget every feeling and every thought. My mind was scattered. Blank. Empty. Parker smiled as he neared his frame, towering over my own. Kai, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Moore, and of course, Rowan. Kai looked down at me, the disinterest prominent on his sharp features. I looked down. His demeanor was nothing short of intimidating. My mother shook me gently. Well, we're going to leave you two to talk a little, Mrs. Parker smiled as well, and stepped aside with my mother, leaving me alone with Kai. I gulped. His face was stone, but his eyes radiated fury. What do I say? What can I say? As awkward as the silence felt, I found it better to stay quiet than speak to him. Kai stared irritably at me as if I was doing something that annoyed him. I tried to look away or act like didn't feel his stare on me, but it was almost impossible with how red my cheeks were getting. Does your mother always make those horrifying sounds? He asked. His question took me off guard. What on earth did he mean? Before I could respond, Kai had walked past me and to the bar where he requested another drink. I sighed in gratefulness. He was finally gone. My mother seemed to notice this and came up to me. Please tell me you didn't scare him away, she fumed. I shook my head. I'm not the one doing the scaring. My mother rolled her eyes and sighed. Just come sit. Worry about him later. I could tell she was stressed. Why? The marriage was already finalized. Why did it matter if we got along? I sat down at the table and kept my eyes on my lap. Can we just go home? Mr. Parker, who I hadn't noticed was there before, sat quietly across from my father, who was also silent. So, Rowan, did you and Kai have a good conversation? Mrs. Parker asked kindly. I smiled and nodded. Yes, he's very sweet. I hated lying, but I couldn't tell her that her son was a complete ass and that I was terrified of him. Good? I'm glad she smiled. My mother squeezed my hand under the table as a thank you. It wasn't for her. It wasn't even for me. Taking another small break. It's currently 4 a.m., and I'm not even tired now, so now that we're here, I figured I'd tell you the plans for the marriage, Mrs. Parker said, putting down a thick packet of papers in front of me. These are contracts you and your parents will sign that agree to our terms, and then we will begin discussing location ideas, Mrs. Parker affirmed. I nodded compliantly. There was no going back, Mr. Parker spoke. The first contract is to ensure you are consenting to the marriage. So are you? No. I'm not. I never wanted this. Yes. Okay, then sign here, please. I felt as though I was signing my life away on the papers. All of my hopes and dreams, as cliché as it sounded, were essentially burned as I wrote my signature. The document signing went by quickly. There was no need to read them. I'd have to sign them either way. Once everything was finished, I put down the pen, an immense feeling of despair writhing over me. Kai had come, clearly drunk and very visibly upset. Kai, Rowan has signed the contracts. It's official, you both are engaged. Mrs. Parker clapped. My heart sank. Engaged. Kai chuckled. Isn't that wonderful too? His voice was dripping with sarcasm. Gold diggers will stop at nothing at the expense of others. His words were slurred. I felt sick. Gold digger? That's what he thought of me. Both of my parents didn't say a word. Mr. and Mrs. Parker were the only ones to address his comment. My cheeks heated and I felt shaky. How was I the gold digger? I didn't even want this. Kai walked away, leaving me in shock at the table. Mr. and Mrs. Parker both apologized countless times, but I didn't care. I hated him.